Hi, everybody. I'm going to offer you today is some introductory material on Sophocles Antigone. I'll start out with something that I'll do with all of the readings, and that is to first just talk a little bit about the author, in this case, obviously, Sophocles. He was a very revolutionary playwright in several respects that I think are helpful to be aware of. After that, I'm just going to go over briefly all the main characters from the play and give you a sense of the relationships between them, and then some issues with the general plot of the play of Antigone. Um, some things to be aware of, some things to think about in reading the play that I think you'll find helpful, add a little more meaning to it, make it a little more interesting. And then, as you know, you will have some discussion questions coming due on the story. Those will get into a little more depth in some of the issues. Um, Having you think a little deeper about some specific aspects of the play and the characters and maybe what Sophocles is trying to do in the play, the mechanisms he uses, um, the question of the sense in which the play is a tragedy. It's certainly considered one of the great tragedies in Greek drama. And so some of those kind of things you'll find in the discussion questions. I've shared with you the groups for the discussion questions so that you know which question set you need to answer. You can just put your responses right on the discussion questions themselves that I've made available to you with the assignment, and then just submit it to Canvas that way. That will be fine. Um, so let me start out by talking a little bit again about Sophocles. He was born about 495 BC, northwest of Athens. The story does not take place in Athens. It takes place in Thebes, which is a little bit away from Athens. So just sort of keep that in mind. Students sometimes think because so much of what we talk about with the Greeks is about Athens, the story takes place there. It actually takes place in Thebes. Sophocles was relatively wealthy, which means he had a good education, was able to study the arts. And at a relatively young age, he started submitting plays to a festival that went on every year, the Theater of Dionysus. You might remember Dionysus is the god of the grape harvest, patron of the arts, wine and winemaking, and a couple things that are somewhat relevant here: ritual madness and religious ecstasy. Those are kind of tied together. And you see them frequently, especially with pagan religions. The a more earthy sort of approach, obviously, to religion. Things like certain kinds of ritual madness and dance and alcohol and things are kind of associated with it. In his first competition, Sophocles took first prize with one of his plays, defeating another great playwright named Aeschylus. His two most famous plays are probably Agamemnon and Prometheus Bound, about the Prometheus tale. And about 120 of Sophocles' plays followed. He went on to win 18 first prizes, though we only really, unfortunately, have 7 of his plays that have survived today that we're still aware of, that sort of lasted over time. He was very much an innovator with his plays. Traditionally at the time, in most plays, they used what was called trilogic form. You would tell a story through 3 different plays. Give you time to develop the characters a little bit, to go in more depth about the story, etc. Sophocles was the first person to consistently try and truncate the whole story into one play. It means that there's not any extra verbiage. Things are a little more intense. They happen a little more quickly. It was a little bit more of a challenge, I think, for authors to do that, for these playwrights to do that, but it then became the norm over time. Aeschylus, for example, is famous for his use of this trilogic form, along with Euripides and some of the other of the tragic poets. But Sophocles really started using this collapsing everything into one play, and certainly Antigone is a good example of that. Some of his other well-known plays are Oedipus the King, probably considered his greatest work, about the story of Oedipus. You might be familiar with that. Some of these plays have made their way into kind of popular culture. We know that Oedipus famously was trying to avoid foreshadowing and an awareness that it was foretold that he was going to kill his father and marry his mother. And in actually trying to avoid doing that, he unwittingly actually ended up doing it and was forced to leave. He was actually the king of Thebes before Creon and Oedipus's sons, who we read about in this particular story. He and Creon were enemies. Creon knew that once Oedipus's family had sort of passed on, that he potentially could become the king of Thebes. And so in trying to avoid this fate, Oedipus actually ended up sealing his fate. There is reference in Antigone in a couple different places to a suggestion that there has been a curse put on Oedipus' family for essentially Oedipus's great crime of, again, killing his father, marrying his mother, and that this crime that he committed and this curse have sort of fated Oedipus' family. So his two sons, who we read about, who obviously killed each other at the beginning of the story, Eteocles and Polynices, or Polynices, I've heard it pronounced both ways, and the daughters, Antigone and Ismene, and that somehow their tragedy in their lives is ultimately the result of this tragic fate that was sort of destined once Oedipus committed his great crimes. Antigone talks about that right at the beginning of the play, all these horrible things that have been happening to the family. And she indeed sees what she does in burying her brother Polynices when Creon, the new king, has permitted that she believes the gods are on her side and that the gods will lift this curse against the family if she does this thing and buries her brother, or she thinks will make the gods happy. I think those are the major things I wanted to mention here. Maybe just one other thing that's helpful to be aware of, I think, is the fact that Sophocles, over the course of his life, spent time both in the military, as a general in the military, and also as a figure in the church. Because of that, it's been argued, when it comes to this great kind of dichotomy, this dilemma in the story of who Antigone and her sister Ismene should feel answerable to, and then who also Creon, the king, the new king, should be answerable to. Sort of between piety, which means sort of a sense of respect and a sense of kind of feeling answerable to, that you see with this piety. Should that piety, should that sense of answerableness to, that respect to, be towards the city, civic piety as it's called, or piety to the gods, which was linked with piety to family, because the gods believed very much in the sanctity of family relationships and following those relationships and being answerable to the rest of your family. So there's this dichotomy. Who should we be answerable to here? The state, the good of the states in civic piety, or to the gods in the family in terms of this religious piety, or what's often called familial or family piety. And we see that that's the great dichotomy here. Sophocles can see both sides and understand them because he was both a church figure and a figure in the military over the course of his life. It's been sort of argued that one of the things that makes this a perfect play and a perfect tragedy is because there's this dilemma, this sort of a no-win dilemma. You have to choose one side or the other. And whatever side you choose, you will in some sense be punished or answerable to the other side. You may have heard of the phrase before, being on the horns of a dilemma, right? If you're able to not be impaled by one horn of the bull and are able to evade it, the other one's going to impale you. It's a no-win situation. And that's one of the things that helps to make this play so dramatic, is because it is a no-win situation here. And it will obviously lead to this great tragedy of the main character Antigone being at odds with her uncle Creon, who takes over as the leader of Thebes after this conflict between her two brothers. So let's talk a little bit about who these main figures are in the play. Antigone, in some sense, is the main figure. She's one of the daughters of Oedipus, along with Ismene, her sister. She is the sister, again, of Eteocles and Polynices. After Oedipus is forced to leave Thebes, he sort of decrees that his two sons, Eteocles and Polynices, are to rule Thebes. But we're told that what has happened here is, and maybe this again is following up on this idea that the family's cursed, that there's inevitably going to be a conflict between the two brothers in terms of who really is the ruler, right? Who really has power. And Eteocles sort of decides that he wants to have power, not share it with his brother, and forces Polynices to flee Thebes. He's ousted. He goes to another city-state. And remember, during the time, Thebes and Argos and these places we hear about are city-states. They're these walled cities that are relatively self-sustaining. They often have farmland around them, or they're built near or on the water so that ships can come in and out. So they do engage in trade sometimes. And sometimes they're a little more cosmopolitan if they engage in trade. Athens was known for that. Or focus a little more on an agrarian economy by having this farmland outside the walls. But when they're in danger, being attacked, everybody kind of goes inside the walls of the city. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the big war between Athens and Sparta. So Polynices is ousted. He goes to Argos. The king of Argos offers him his daughter as a bride. He puts together an army and comes back to attack Thebes to take what he thinks was rightfully his, because his father Oedipus declared that he and his brother are to share power. Now, after they kill each other, their uncle Creon is kind of next in line to take over as leader of Thebes. He argues in several points, right, that Polynices was just trying to destroy Thebes and its gods, that he was going to destroy the army of Thebes. We don't necessarily know that, exactly what his purpose was. Was he just going to come back and try and gain power again and get his brother to share power with him? Was he just trying to take back what is his? We don't necessarily know he wanted to destroy Thebes. Certainly, if he wants to take over Thebes and regain his place as a single ruler or ruling with his brother, that he's not going to destroy the city. I mean, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But Creon certainly argues that that's the case. And what would often happen at the time when you had these battles between these two great armies was, instead of the armies clashing directly themselves, that they would have their best fighters fight against each other and try and settle it that way to try and make sure there was not more bloodshed. And they talk about the fact that there were these 7 gates of Thebes, and that the Theban army had its gates manned by its great 7 warriors, and Thebes then got its great 7 warriors to try and defeat the warriors of Thebes. And that if they would defeated these warriors of Thebes, then they could rightfully take over the city, and that was the way things were ideally supposed to happen, so the armies themselves didn't have to clash and have all this great bloodshed. It's not clear what happened in this case. Excuse me. We do know, however, that in this battle between the 7 great warriors on both sides, Eteocles and Polynices fought each other and ended up murdering each other. So there's no longer anybody there to rule, so Creon takes over power of Thebes. Creon's wife was the sister of Oedipus. That makes Creon the uncle of Eteocles and Polynices and of Antigone and her sister Isme. So he is a family member, but he's sort of a family member through marriage, and he clearly would like to take over power of Thebes himself, and clearly wants to kind of rule with an iron fist to kind of get rid of the rest of Oedipus's family, who, again, he sees as his rival through his wife, Eurydice, who was Oedipus' sister. So there was tension between the families sort of to begin with. To make things even more interesting, Creon's son, Haman, was betrothed to Antigone. That was going to be another way in which Creon could connect himself with the family of Oedipus and again potentially become ruler, was through his son Haman marrying Antigone. One other important character here is Tiresias, the blind prophet. And a lot of these stories in the mythology that's tied up with them, you end up with these blind prophet sort of characters. The idea that they're blind to the sort of outside world gives them a special insight. They only focus on this intuition or this insight they have that allows them to be prophets. There are lots of prophets throughout history and various kinds of stories that even made their way into popular culture. Any of you who have ever seen the old TV sitcom Tool Time with Tim Taylor, when he frequently has problems, he wants to go for advice somewhere, he goes to his neighbor. You never see his neighbor's face directly. He always remains mysterious. He's always behind a fence or something else. These prophets always were to be somewhat mysterious. They just kind of appear out of nowhere. And Tiresias is an example. Tiresias has evidently given Creon advice before and tries to give him advice again about how to handle this situation after this battle between Argos and Thebes, and directly between Eteocles leading the Theban army and Polynices leading the army from Argos. One other sort of character here that's in a lot of these plays is a chorus. The chorus is sort of the voice of the people. It plays somewhat different roles depending on the particular play and the particular playwright. In this case, it's the old men of Thebes who make up the chorus. They can sometimes offer commentary on the play, maybe suggest how the reader or the person viewing the play live should interpret what's going on, points out what some of the important issues. Sometimes you see the chorus being swayed back and forth between the different characters and who they find, whose position or whose arguments they find sort of more attracted to. Sometimes there's a person who speaks for the chorus, a single character from the chorus. But these choruses are very common in these plays. So these are sort of the main characters and their roles in the play. Let's talk a little bit about what happens in the play in terms of the basic storyline here. And I'll again tell you a few things to kind of think a little bit about, to be aware of with the story. Then again, I think will give you a little more insight and you might find helpful in answering the discussion questions. I'm going to share a screen with you briefly here with the study guide that I wanted you to read along with the play that you'll find in Canvas. And the first item here is important, the setting of the play. First of all, these plays did not have the kind of set you would see today if you were to go to a play in the theater, or even during Shakespeare's time. There was not a whole lot on the stage. The focus was really on the actors themselves, and sometimes actresses in the different traditions. Sometimes males would actually play the female parts. Typically, it was young males before their voices changed. They would play the points of the role of females. It's not clear exactly if that was the case in this situation. We know that was common in Shakespeare's time. And you'll see here that the play begins the morning after this battle took place, where these brothers killed each other. Rather than show these plays at night, these plays were often put on during the daytime and actually in the morning. So the people who were going to view the play would be viewing the play at the same time of day that the story opens, the morning after this battle took place, and where these two brothers slay each other. So that would add to the drama for anybody who was actually kind of seeing the play live here. Another thing that I think you'll find sort of interesting here is that I think it asks, about halfway down here, the page here, how old do you think Antigone is? If you look at, I don't know which edition you're reading, but sometimes the glossary of some of the other editions will have more information. Antigone was only 15 when the story took place. Not only do we see her criticized for being really assertive as a female, which he did not do at the time, and you'll see that Creon is very critical of Antigone for questioning his rule as a female. We see that Antigone's sister, Ismene, is not willing to go against the new king, Creon, because she's a female and it's not her place. Not only that, Antigone is only 15. So Creon has in his mind two reasons not to challenge and question his rule. We know that what has happened here in the storyline, if we go through the basic sequence of events, right, we begin with the morning here. It's after the battle has taken place. And Antigone goes to her sister and says, look, Creon has decreed that nobody is to offer burial to Polynices, right, to our brother Polynices. He has given burial and allowed burial to Eteocles, our other brother, because he was defending the city. And in Creon's mind, it deserves to be buried with all the ceremony that would have been expected at the time. Indeed, that the gods would have sort of demanded that kind of ceremonial burial. But he has said that nobody should bury Polynices. His body should be left to rot and be eaten by the birds, etc., because he was a traitor to the city, because he came back to the city and tried to attack it. Now, Creon wants to say that he wanted to destroy the city. We don't necessarily know that. We know that he maybe wanted to get back his rule again, in which case he wouldn't have wanted to destroy the city. But Creon claims that that was the case, that he was going to destroy the city, etc. And so Antigone is very headstrong and very assertive, even at the age of 15, and says, look, as women, one of the only duties that we are given in the city and by the gods is the right and even the duty to take place with, to do these burial ceremonies. So not only is he leaving our brother out to rot, which will sort of keep him from getting into the afterlife, he is also keeping us from doing what is our only real duty, the only real authority that we are sort of given here. And they claim that it will anger the gods not to bury the body of Polynices. Again, you can pronounce it either way. So Antigone is very concerned about this. She wants to bury her brother. She asks Ismene to help her. Ismene says, no, I'm not going to. She says it's not the place of women to challenge the decrees of men. Creon really wants to bring order to the city again, so he makes this decree that Polynices will not be buried. And we know that Antigone wants to do it anyway. She believes that the gods are on her side because the gods want the body buried. They want this religious ceremony to take place. Her family would have wanted it. And indeed, she believes the people of Thebes will be behind her for doing this, even though Creon has decreed otherwise. Creon really wants to think that his power, his rule, should be what people are answerable to, right? So he's appealing to civic piety here, piety to the state. Antigone is appealing to piety to the gods and to family in wanting to bury her brother. So we know that the next thing that happens that's important here is that one of the guards who's supposed to guard Polynices' body and make sure it's not buried comes to Creon and says, hey, it looks like somebody attempted to bury your body. There's been sand or dirt that's been thrown over the body. It's suggested maybe that these were passersby who threw this dirt or sand on the body because they knew it would anger the gods. There was something called miasma, spelled M-I-A-S-M-A, which was a kind of pollution. And typically, these kind of pagan beliefs had a practical purpose and a religious purpose. There's a practical purpose for burying bodies in that their bodies could carry disease, and the stench would be horrible. The kind of religious purpose is, again, they needed proper burial before they could make it into the afterlife. The afterlife for these pagan religions did not consist in a heaven or hell or anything like that. The afterlife was a place that everybody went if they were buried, and you would live the rest of your existence there. And it was not a very happy place. It was kind of a dark place, but it wasn't a place where you're being tortured either, and it certainly wasn't a heavenly kind of place. But you would not end up there unless you were buried. So it looks like some people, we don't know if there's necessarily Antigone involved yet, but some people tried to bury the body or at least throw dirt or sand on it. So they go to Creon and tell him, he's very angry. He tells the guards, well, you better go back and make sure that, this doesn't happen again. Your lives are on the line here because your duty is to guard the body and make sure it's not buried. Guards comes back and says, hey, somebody's buried the body. We know, at least this time, it was Antigone who tried to do it. The guard makes some suggestions here. He talks about how there were some, the wind was kicking up and dirt was flying around and sand was flying around, and the next thing they know, the body's been buried. I think we're maybe supposed to believe that the gods had helped Antigone bury the body. They talk about the fact that there were no footprints or anything, and that the body was heavy, large, and they don't think, somebody would have been it would have been very difficult for somebody to be able to bury the body. But then they find Antigone there, and she doesn't try and hide the fact. she is perfectly happy to say, yes, it was me. I did it. Because she thinks the people will be on her side and the gods will be on her side. She even tells her sister Ismene, don't, if Creon becomes angry because the body's buried and you know it's me, don't hide the fact. Go ahead and tell him, yeah, it was Antigone, it was my sister who did it. It seems like she really wants to be honored here. She kind of wants to be seen as a martyr. She thinks it will take the curse off the family because they don't make the gods happy that she buried the body. And it looks like she's a little bit out to, enhance her own reputation. So she doesn't try to hide the fact that she buried the body. So the guard takes Antigone, goes back to Creon. Whenever they talk about a person who might try and bury the body, they always say he, because they assume it would be a male, that no female would ever try and go against the king. It turns out to be his niece, Antigone. He's obviously frustrated by this, right? Upset by this, that she has tried to bury the body. He has decreed that if somebody tries to bury the body, they will be publicly stoned to death, which was a common means of killing people who were enemies of the state at the time. The public would come out, they pick up stones, person would have to stand against the wall, and they basically stone them to death. You'll notice that Creon changes the punishment a little bit. He says that instead of being stoned to death, Antigone will be walled up in a cave with some food. It would last her maybe a week, and she would gradually starve to death once the food was gone. That way, Creon wasn't directly killing her, which he believes will not anger the gods and make the gods want to punish him. And it would also not cause this miasma. She'd be buried inside this cave, this pollution that would kind of rise out of the body, would not, anger the gods, etc. I think he also thinks it's what they often call today, visually, it's not going to look bad. The optics of the situation wouldn't look good if Creon was to stand there and watch people stone his niece. But to have her die in a cave where people can't see her and die slowly, that doesn't have the same bad optics as having her stoned to death would. So we know that Haman, right, who was betrothed to Antigone, Creon's son, goes to his father, says, please change your mind. I respect you, father, etc. But this is the woman I love. This is a horrible way for her to die. Can't you change your mind? He doesn't want to change his mind because he doesn't want to look weak. Right? There's just been this big disturbance in the city. He wants to look like he's a powerful ruler, that people aren't going to challenge him, that he will follow through. If he tells people, if you do this, I will put you to death, and he's going to follow through on what he says, on his decrees. He says to him, there are more fish in the sea, you'll find a better wife somewhere else. And he also says, look, you're just a child. What right do you have? You're acting like a woman, he even says, coming to me and trying to tell me what to do. It's interesting when the guard brings Antigone to Creon, he talks about her as though she thinks she's acting like a male. In the original text, he uses male pronouns to talk about Antigone. That was not because of the assumption that you always use male pronouns or anything like that. That was done because she was trying to act like a man, telling him what to do. And now she tells Haman, look, you're a boy, and you're acting like a female, trying to tell me what to do, etc. So Haman's last word kind of suggests, well, if Antigone dies, you might find that there are other people who die too. It's almost a threat to his father and saying, look, I'm going to kill myself if you follow through on this. So Haman goes off. Tiresias, the blind prophet, shows up and tries to tell Creon, look, you should think about what you're doing here. There's some bad signs. The people are angry. They're on Antigone's side. You better, I would rethink what you're doing here. I've never led you wrong before. I've always given you good advice. You should really think about this carefully. At first, Creon doesn't relent. Eventually, he's convinced by Tiresias, okay, I better do this. I don't want the people to revolt. And if the gods really are mad, I don't want that to happen. So let's go as fast as we can and free Antigone. Right? They go to free Antigone. By the time they show up, she has hung herself to death. She has wanted to she's wanted to put her life back in her hands and take away from Creon the right to end her life himself. This was a move of agency on her part. This was her saying, I'm going to control my fate, not you, and I'm going to take my own life. That's an important assertion of agency on the part of Antigone here. Haman finds her dead, and Creon shows up. He's angry at Creon. He tries to stab Creon with his sword. He misses, and then he stabs himself and kills himself. Creon's distraught. Antigone's dead. His son is dead. He knows the gods are still going to be angry at him because of what happened and what he caused. The people are going to be angry at him. Everybody ends up going back to Thebes. Eurydice is there. One of the things that I didn't mention earlier, Creon and Eurydice had another son who was killed during the battle. It may have been he was one of the other great warriors. And now Haman's dead. So when the guards and the people end up going back to Thebes and Eurydice is there, she finds out that Antigone is dead and that Haman's dead. She lost her other son to the battle. And she's distraught. She blames Creon for causing all this death and all this tragedy. Right? This is a tragic play. And she goes off, and the silly people who are sort of remaining there, after a couple minutes, they say, hey, maybe we shouldn't have just let her go off like that. She might do something desperate. It's too late, right? They go off to find her. She's killed herself. So there are all these deaths that have occurred. Some maybe because of Oedipus's great sin in killing his father and marrying his mother, and maybe the bad idea of having his two sons rule once he's ousted from Thebes, that inevitably they're going to have a battle with each other for power. They kill each other. Antigone's dead. Haman's dead. Eurydice's other son is dead, having killed himself. Excuse me, not having killed himself, having been killed in the battle. Creon's there, and he's like, okay, he's left alone by himself. Basically, the rest of his family is gone. The people are angry at him. The gods are angry at him. Right? So one of the things I wanted one of the discussion groups to think a little bit about here is think a little bit about what happens next here. Does Creon remain in power? Does he change the way he rules? Do the people force him out of power? Sort of what happens here? Interesting to kind of think about that. The play is called Antigone. We're to see her as the main tragic figure. What if the play was called Creon instead? He's the one who's living at the end. He's the one whose family is gone. He's experienced this tragedy and that he has to somehow go on with his life. Would we view the play any different if it had been called Creon and not Antigone? Would we view Creon more as the tragic figure? Does the chorus ever seem to side with one person or the other, with Antigone or Creon? Or do they seem like they go back and forth? Do they seem kind of fickle? Does Sophocles ultimately want to cast blame on one side or another? It's been claimed that this was a perfect play because neither side was right. Both sides were wrong, but they were also both right in some sense. They were both stubborn, however. Antigone and Creon couldn't kind of work out a deal or She couldn't have come to him and say, "Can I please bury my brother," or somewhere else, or do something, right? They were both very stubborn. So they both had a tragic flaw in that sense, right? You can understand and sympathize with them to an extent. You can certainly sympathize with Antigone. You can sympathize with Creon wanting to maintain Thebes, not wanting it to fall into a rabble after this big battle had taken place, wanting to assert his control. But again, they were both stubborn at the same time. So we can think about that a little bit too, you know. It's a kind of a tragic collision of two people who were trying to do the right thing, but ended up, doing something that led to all these deaths. So those are some things to think about with the play. And the different characters. Again, I have posted the discussion questions for you to answer and posted your group so you know which questions set to respond to. Think carefully about the questions. Many of them are interpretation oriented. That's how I often do the questions. I may have my own way of interpreting the play, but I know you may interpret it differently. That's fine. I'm not ultimately looking for you to interpret the play exactly the same way I do. These things are written to be open-ended. So it's fine if you interpret it, the way you want to. Feel like you can answer the questions genuinely with your own ideas, your own views. Again, always, if you have any questions, send me an email. I can respond over email. If you'd like to talk with me directly, we could always set something up. Just let me know. I hope you find the play interesting. There's so many different aspects to it. It's been hugely important in political philosophy and literature and playwriting, and giving us a sense for how people viewed the individual, the good of the state versus the good of the individual, the good of the state versus the power of the gods. We'll gradually see in the things we'll be reading a movement towards civic piety and away from religious piety. We'll see that pretty clearly when we read Plato's dialogues, and we see Plato appealing more to reason and rationality and to the good of the society through having a ideal society and maybe putting human reason and rationality above the authority of the gods. And remember the time the gods were these mythological figures. We'll talk a little bit more about their importance. So lots to think about here. So again, please let me know if you have any questions. I hope you find that discussion helpful. Let me know if there are any other issues that you have with the play. And I will talk to you again soon. Thank you.